Alright, so today's lesson will be focusing on the process of the gaseous exchange in plants. Now, in last lesson, we focused on the structures, right? Say, for example, the leaf. How does it allow gas exchange to occur? And how stomata helps to let the gas go in and out. But today, we are focusing on the type of gas that is going in and out of the leaf. Now, at the first glance, this may seem a stupid question, because if you think about human, this doesn't worth any discussion, because any time of the day, human is taking in oxygen and breathing out CO2, and this stands for all animals. So there is no discussion nothing worth discussing in animals, and that is because animals only carry out respiration. Now you don't need to copy these. These are just you do not need to copy this photo. This is just an introduction. Okay, you may not have this in your notes, but this page, I mean. So maybe you just need to take a look, and at the end, take a photo for you to help thinking. Okay, so the type of gas going in and out of animal is so easy to understand because animal only carries out respiration. So we always need oxygen, and we always produce CO2 that we want to remove. So therefore, the type of gas going in and out of an animal is easy. Can you now understand why plant is more complicated? Because if you think about plant, the first difference is that plant carry out two processes. That differs in the gas exchange. A leaf carries out photosynthesis, but opposite to respiration, it uses CO2 but not O2, right? But it produces oxygen. So that's the difference in the type of gas going in and out. But the discussion doesn't stop here. 咁你話換咗隻 gas 啫嘛，而家 take in CO2， 咁人 animal take in O2， the plant take in CO2， 咁好簡單啫，係嘛？ But the discussion doesn't stop here, because don't forget, plant also carries out respiration. But respiration takes in O2, gives out CO2. So eventually, we need a conclusion. So at the end of the day, what gas does the plant take in? What gas does the plant give out? So that is a more complicated discussion than animals. So what we need to consider is that we need to compare the process of photosynthesis and respiration and see which process wins out in this gas exchange story. And one more thing to bear in mind is that photosynthesis only occurs when there is light. So therefore, we have to split our discussion into daytime and nighttime, because the story would be different, because the process that is happening would be different. Now that is the reason why I take this video. Is quite important, so I want you to be able to replay this video for certain parts if you can't understand in time. Okay? And we're going to start from daytime, because at daytime both process takes place. So I changed my picture because I want to put the same gas on one side for you to understand more easily. So say for example, my question now is, does the plant take in or give out carbon dioxide in daytime? So I pick one gas to think about first. So I think like this. Photosynthesis take in CO2. Respiration gives out CO2. The reason I write this such a small way is that I also consider in daytime, very likely, the rate of respiration of photosynthesis is faster than the rate of respiration. So meaning that the amount of CO2 taken in and used by photosynthesis will be greater than the amount of CO2 released by respiration. Therefore, when I overall consider both process, I would have a conclusion that there is a net uptake of CO2. And I hope you understand why I have to add the word net here. Because I considered both processes, and eventually when I get to the conclusion, it means that the plant will take in CO2. Okay? So, can you now spend a little bit time to think about how to consider oxygen? So I hope you pause this video and try to think like what I did. And I'll draw it on the left hand side. Alright, so I'll continue now. So if you want to think more, so just pause the video. Photosynthesis release oxygen, but respiration takes in oxygen. So what it means is that since photosynthesis is much faster than respiration, it means that overall there is a net release of oxygen. So that's what's happening in the daytime. And I would... okay, so let's go to the nighttime then. Nighttime is super easy because there is no photosynthesis at all. So that means the gas exchange would follow, or would only be determined by respiration, which gives out CO2 and take in oxygen. So at night, there's a net release of CO2 and net uptake of O2. So that's the first part. So how I remember this is like this. At night, they don't do photosynthesis, so they're just like human. They're just like animal. Take in oxygen, give out carbon dioxide, just like us. But in daytime, it's opposite. It's reversed because they do something that animals can't do, and that is photosynthesis. And photosynthesis dominates. So that's why the gas exchange follow photosynthesis. Okay? I can also consider that in another way. So let me show you how I consider the events in the daytime in another way, so that in your future notes, when you analyze graphs like that, it will be easier. So let's use CO2 as an example. So say, for example, P is much greater than R. So this time in this discussion, I would set some numbers for you to help you think. All right? Photosynthesis have to take in CO2, right? While respiration gives out CO2. So I would think in another way. If now photosynthesis at that moment, if the leaf is carrying out photosynthesis, that need to use 20 unit of CO2, while respiration release 5 units of CO2. So how would the leaf do gaseous exchange then? The answer would be like this. The reason that the plant would have net net uptake of CO2 is like this. Well, the respiration produce 5 CO2, right? 5 units of CO2. But actually, they won't come out. If I think in a simpler way. Why? Because all these 5 CO2 would be directly used by photosynthesis already. Okay, so that's thinking number one. All the CO2 released by respiration would be directly used by the leaf already. So my next question is, how much CO2 does the plant need to uptake from air? The answer is not 20, but it's only 15. Why? Because together with the respiration, with the 5 CO2 from respiration and 15 CO2 from the air, now the plant would get the 20 CO2 they need for photosynthesis. And this 15 CO2 is the net uptake of the CO2 from air. Understand? So both the respiration and the air supply CO2 for photosynthesis. But think about this. When we measure how the plant do gaseous exchange, we can only measure this. We can only measure how much CO2 is changed in the air. So if I'm allowed to skip this page, because I think you can fill in this page easily, so I'm going to skip this. But you have to fill in this, okay? If I'm going to plot a graph to illustrate how the plant uptake or release CO2, I can only measure the amount of CO2 change in the air. That means I can only measure net uptake or release of CO2. So here, in this graph, that is the reason why the y-axis is the net uptake and net release of CO2. And that is related to air. So you may mark it down that this is about the gas content in air. So now, I think this is the first part, okay? The first part is to realize that plants' gaseous exchange is more complicated than animal, especially when the plant is doing photosynthesis and respiration together. When the rate of photosynthesis is faster than the rate of respiration, then the plant would be taking in CO2 and giving out oxygen as a net result. And this is opposite to what animal does. And you have to present the explanation in words. And that comes to this part. Okay? And that comes to this part. Moreover, you should realize that now the amount of these gases coming in and out depends on how fast photosynthesis is, right? And the speed of photosynthesis is affected by light intensity. So that's why the light intensity would affect how much CO2 the plant take in or release as a result. And that is the meaning of this graph. How light intensity would affect the release or uptake of CO2. And we think light intensity would affect because light intensity would affect the rate of photosynthesis. Remember that photosynthesis use or uptake CO2, produce O2. Therefore, you can imagine, you can at once have a very quick idea. The greater the light intensity it is, the more the CO2 the plant takes in from air. Agree? Well, so that is the reason why. That is the reason why you can see that the graph is going up. Because the greater the light intensity, the faster the rate of photosynthesis. So let's analyze this graph bit by bit. by putting in A, B, C, D, and E here. AB represents complete darkness here. So let's imagine this part, I didn't increase the light intensity, but let's say this is complete darkness for this section. So the plant is only doing respiration, and that is why the graph stays at the lowest point of this curve. And you can imagine this would be a negative number, right? Say negative 20. The negative here means release of CO2. And the number 20 means that respiration would give out, let's say, 20 units of CO2. Just like the idea in here. Alright, let me change to 5, okay? Match up with the picture I've shown. So as the light intensity increase, the rate of photosynthesis would increase. But you can see there is a region that there is not yet a net uptake of CO2. Why? 有 photosynthesis 咯，有光咯，點解仲係 release 緊 CO2 嘅咧？因為 photosynthesis 唔夠快啊嘛，咁所以喺呢度請你寫低 P 細過 R 啦。When P is smaller than R, I want 請你改 notes 裏面幾句説話得唔得？我覺得呢句説話寫得唔夠好，你咁樣好難明嘅。你自己攞圖嗰頁改咗佢啦。咁你 pause 一 pause 個 video， 準備好咧先再 play 咯。Photosynthesis 有發生，但係唔夠快嘅後果係咩咧？It means that the amount of CO2 used by P is still less than the amount of CO2 released by R. 我哋喺呢度做個實際例子啦，好嘛？你寫完先。我哋假設我哋研究緊呢一點啊，好冇？好啦，呢棵 plant 喺呢個時候做唔做 respiration 咧？梗係做啦，因為無時無刻一棵 plant 都會無時無刻做 respiration 噶嘛。佢個 respiration rate 等於幾多咧？其實你諗下，頭先已經知㗎啦。呢棵 plant 咪就係做緊5個 unit 嘅 respiration 咯。因為佢喺 complete darkness 裏面 respiration 係5啊嘛，咁佢唔會變嘅喎。其實我哋認為植物個 respiration rate 好穩定嘅喎。好啦，而家 photosynthesis rate 係細過 respiration，因為 light intensity is still quite low. So let us say the photosynthesis rate is now 2. 咁呢棵植物 就會好得意啦。佢有做 photosynthesis， 但佢仍然會有個 net release of CO2。你估下 net release 幾多？咁我哋一齊睇下點解咯。Respiration 整咗5個 CO2 出嚟，但係 photosynthesis 咧用咗其中2個，咁即係話走出空氣裡面嘅咧就只係得3個。記唔記先？嗱，再講一次 ，respiration 整咗5個 CO2 出嚟，其中2個俾 photosynthesis 用咗，所以咧就有3個走咗出去 air 裡面。So when we measure the change in CO2 in the air, we will find out that there would be a net release of -3. So this value would be -3. OK？ 記唔記？即係話而家複雜啲咯喎，有光都唔等於棵植物一定會有個 net uptake of CO2 嘅，要 depends on how much light is there。其實要 depends on 嘅就係到底邊個快啊？如果 P 仍然細過 R， 咪 R 主導咯。好啦，所以咧，我想你而家重新寫多次 C to E， C to D， 例如其實 C D E 係一樣嘅 ，C D E 係一樣嘅。總之就係個光已經夠啦，夠到一個地步咩啊？夠到一個地步 P 大過 R 啦，所以要結論一棵植物 ，what type of gas does it take in or give out？ 首先要做嘅比較就係 P versus R。咁又點呢？咁你而家就要諗下嗰啲 CO2 嘅出出入入啦。你可唔可以寫到第2句俾我睇咧？修正翻呢一句。好，我而家開估啦喎，有需要你 pause 咗個 video 諗下先。So here it means that the amount of CO2 used by P is greater than the amount of CO2 released by R。 So what does it mean？ 即係話冇錯 ，CO respiration 會整啲 CO2 出嚟俾 photosynthesis 用，但係根本就唔夠用，因為而家光得好緊要 ，photosynthesis 要用好多 CO2 啊嘛，唔夠用咁點算啊？就要喺空氣度攞。Therefore, the plant would have a net uptake of CO2 from air。 你想寫清楚啲，呢度可以寫 to air 啦。呢度可以寫翻清楚，全黑嘅時候都係 net release of CO2 to air。OK， 修正好晒啲碌屎先。好啦，跟住咧， 我哋就去上面呢度咯。咁我哋真係又揀一個 situation 嚟睇下，例如我求其 mark 呢點好嘛？咁我要作數字，我要點作咧？你幻想下，俾你作，你會作啲咩數字落去啊？有一個數字你唔可以亂作嘅，諗唔諗到？10秒，點樣可以作兩個數字去表達而家有個 net uptake of CO2 from air 咧？有個數字唔可以亂作 ，respiration 應該都係5，因為同一棵植物嚟㗎嘛。咁所以如果佢喺 darkness 裏面做嘅 respiration rate 係5咧，應該成棵 plant 喺任何光度下面嘅 respiration 都係5。但係 photosynthesis 而家係幾多啊？就應該大過5啦，係咪？我哋作個數字啊，嚟15啊嘛，嚟20啦，按翻我哋頭先個故事啊，好嘛？咁即係咩意思咧？Respiration 整咗5個 CO2 出嚟，但係都唔夠 photosynthesis 用喎，因為 photosynthesis 要用20個啊嘛，咁點算啊？佢就要喺空氣度攞15個 CO2 啦。咁呢個數字咧就會係15定係20咧？呢個數字就只能夠係15，因為我哋只能夠 measure 到個 net change in air，我哋唔能夠真實地量度到有幾多 CO2 係 photosynthesis 用咗，我哋只能夠推論啫。OK， 得唔得？咁即係話，隨住光度上升，會首先由 P 細過 R， 慢慢突然光度夠啦，變成為 P 大過 R， 咁棵植物就會反轉自己個 gaseous exchange 啦。由唔夠光嘅時候，哇！消失得咁慢，因為好由唔夠光嘅時候，一路都係 release CO2 uptake oxygen。去到光度夠啦 ，P 夠快咯，就反轉啦，反轉跟 photosynthesis， 棵植物會 uptake CO2 release oxygen。OK，I mean in a net way， 得唔得？好，請問 C 有咩咁特別咧？C 就係嗰一刻，the rate of photosynthesis is just equal to the rate of respiration。第二句點寫啊？It means that the amount of CO2 used by P is the same as the amount of CO2 released by R. So what would be the gaseous exchange with the air? 咁即係話 respiration 整嘅 CO2 啱啱好夠 photosynthesis 用晒佢，咁所以咪 no net uptake or release of CO2 咯。And we call this the compensation point because it compensates the amount of CO2 produced by respiration is just enough to compensate the CO2 usage by photosynthesis. And that's why it's called compensation point. OK? 好啦，呢個係第二部分。今日嘅請你花少少時間理解好咧，先至去第三部分。第三部分我哋唔講呢度住，呢度咧我想親身留翻上堂嘅時候同你講 ，OK？ 但係呢度都只不過係 P 大過 R 啫嘛，繼續。好啦，呢個實驗係人工嘅，我哋有棵植物，跟住咧有盞燈照住佢。跟住咧，我哋移前移後去睇下唔同嘅 light intensity 點樣影響呢棵 plant。咁所以個 graph 就會係咁樣去啦。你一路將盞燈拱咗埋去，越嚟越光嘅時候，咁咪 photosynthesis 越嚟越快 ，uptake 越嚟越多咯 of CO2，net uptake of CO2。OK， 好啦，但係我哋要諗下。如果我哋而家睇呢棵植物喺一個自然嘅環境度生長，咁佢嗰個 gas exchange 嘅 graph 會係咩樣咧？咁樣，咁我想你一齊同我諗下。我哋量度一棵植物一日嘅 gas exchange 嘅變化。我哋今次唔係做實驗咯，我哋真係量一個植物喺大自然一日。咁所以咧，呢度係正午12點。我哋呢個係 time of the day。呢個就係午夜12點，即係凌晨12點啦。咁呢度就係第24個鐘，其實都即係凌晨12點啦。OK， 咁請問個 graph 會係咩樣咧？咁我哋首先諗下咯，個 graph 會係喺正數開始啊，定係負數開始啊？呢個係凌晨12點，即係冇陽光。你點畫中間先？我想你跟住一齊 sketch 喎，好嘛？所以咧。我為咗證明你有睇到我呢段片睇晒啊，你要 send 俾我睇你 sketch 嘅呢個 graph。嗱，你最好唔好抄我啦，你試下預先 sketch 咗先。而家試完再改，你要影張相俾我，我就會 send 後來 worksheet 嘅答案俾你睇啊。OK， 好。咁所以凌晨12點冇陽光嘅喎，咁啊 respiration only 一定喺呢度啦。明唔明先？咁我哋由呢度開始，一路都冇陽光嘅喎，係嘛？你諗下幅 graph 係點樣？一路都冇陽光嘅喎，直到幾時啊？直到凌晨6點大概？點解？日出啦嘛，有日出，有 photosynthesis 咯喎 ，so there would be CO2 usage by photosynthesis, and that's why less CO2 will be released. 咁所以個數字咪負得越嚟越少咯。開始你幻想下係咪？本來呢度可能係-5、-4、-3、-2、-1，因為 release 得越嚟越少 CO2 出 air 咯喎。 直到幾時啊？直到有一刻，我唔知幾點，但係總之呢一刻就係 sunrise， 啱唔啱？好啦，直到有一個 moment， 喂，夠光咯，光到 P 大過 R 咯，係嘛？好啦，跟住12點陽光好猛烈，唔理啦。嗱，你中意，其實你呢個圖係點嘅樣都得噶，你中意咁樣尖形又得，咁樣又得，咁樣又得，冇所謂嘅。嗰度我哋估嘅啫，係嘛？冇人知嗰日個陽光程度係點。咁我哋當佢維持一段時間啦。好啦。去到某一個位，天色開始會暗嘅咯，係嘛？ So the light intensity would decrease， 咁所以幅 graph 就會跌翻落嚟啦。跌到有一刻，喂 photosynthesis 仲要慢過 respiration 喎，一路落，直到幾時啊？直到完全冇陽光，係嘛？咁嘅時候，佢就只會繼續做翻 respiration， 因為全黑啦嘛。好，第一，請問點解 ？OK， 你畫完之後，我哋諗下，點解唔係呢度先係 sunrise 咧？嗱，我有好多學生誤會呢度先係 sunrise 㗎。如果我而家拆咗佢再嚟過，你就咁睇呢幅 graph。你會唔會諗？你識唔識點樣諗翻幾時係 sunrise， 幾時係 sunset 咧？就唔係呢度啦。好，我想你答我幾樣嘢啊！你要寫喺嗰個答案裡面啊。我哋作啲數字，我哋作啲點啊，好嘛 ？A 啊 ，B 啊 ，C 啊 ，D、E 啊 ，F、G、H、I、J，OK？喺呢幅 graph 裡面，我唔好問呢啲，我不如咁樣問啦。So in which period does the plant carry out photosynthesis？ 好，請你將呢個畫好嘅 graph 連埋你嘅答案 WhatsApp send 俾我 ，send 完之後就去做呢張 worksheet。OK， 做完再 send 多次俾我，我就會 send 呢個嘅答案同埋 explanation video 俾你。呢一 part 係成課最緊要考得最多嘅地方。OK，make sure 你 take 呢個 weekend，take today，take Friday 呢個 weekend 去溫習。我星期一會有個簡單嘅 quiz 嘅。OK，好，再見，記得 send 俾我啊！